So Elohim is a masculine plural form word. It is a word that many Bibles translate as God. If you read it in the plural, you will begin to recognize that you're reading the summary forms of the Anuna stories, the Anunnaki stories. It boils down to the fact that the Elohim word in Hebrew is the Hebrew word for Anunnaki. It confuses people because it gets translated as God, but in other places, Elohim can be false gods. What are they, you might ask? Can be angels, can be landlords. It has this great elasticity to it. People often ask me, do I believe in an historical Jesus with the lack of that evidence? And I do personally, because I think it's easy to track how the Roman Empire hijacked and then distorted the Christian story.
Yes.
And I don't think it would have needed to do that if there wasn't an authentic Jesus story prior that was inconvenient to the empire.
Yeah.
So that makes me very confident that there really was a Jesus and an original Jesus tradition. But historicity was not the be-all and end-all to the early Christians. So if you go to someone like Justin Martyr, who was martyred for his faith, his big argument was not our stories are history and yours are rubbish. His argument was, you talk about figures in your stories, you Romans, you Greeks, you talk about resurrection, you talk about ascension, you talk about sons and daughters of Zeus. You need to let us make the same claims for our Jesus. Thank you very much. We're not saying anything new. Yeah. We just want to say about our Jesus what you're saying about your figures. That's very different from the argument for historicity that a lot of apologists are interested in today. Yeah. So I think if you're looking for historicity, then you tend to focus all your interest on the earliest Gospels and the canonical Gospels, the one that cohere with orthodoxy, whereas my interest is a little bit different to that. I like to go even earlier than that, to the very earliest sources. And so a lot of scholars believe the Gospel of Thomas is probably the earliest Gospel. And I think there are form analytical clues in the text that's what you're looking at. It's not finessed. It's not accommodated to other Gospels. It's not accommodated to orthodoxy. It's a primitive document. We have Thomas. We have Q, which is the common written source used by Matthew and Luke. And we have the original version of the Gospel of Mark. And you can find the original version in the Codex Sinaiticus. Yeah. The Gospel of Mark is there, but there's no resurrection narrative.
Correct.
So in Thomas, Q, and Mark, you've got sayings, and in Mark, deeds as well, but no resurrection narrative. And that tells us that there were communities of faith producing literature for whom that was not a central part of the story, which I find very intriguing. So I love going back to the beginnings, looking at what primitive Christianity was before the orthodoxization began. But then I'm interested in how it developed as well. So I'm interested in the other Gospels, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, Pistis Sophia, texts like that, because they tell me what other Christian communities were thinking, what their beliefs were about Jesus. And some of these are pretty early. I mean, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the earliest fragment of that is earlier than the earliest fragment we have for the Gospel of Matthew.
That's a fact.
So it's not that they're much, much later. They're very, very close in time, written in the 200s. And they tell us what Christians believed at that point, what their wisdom teachings were. And if I'm going to those texts, I'm going with different questions. I might be going with wisdom questions as well. If I'm looking for teachings about ascension, how to evolve, how to become more than I am, those texts really major on questions like that. Yeah. And so I think sometimes it's easy to talk at cross purposes because people's interest in the Bible is different. Some want to prove history.
Mhm.
Some want to prove orthodoxy.
Mhm.
I'm interested in what the early Christians believed and what wisdom they have for me to take away. So I think
Correct.
that it's worth acknowledging that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are different perspectives and different perceptions and even different agendas based on the person that's trying to interpret the text. And so people will look at different versions and claim that, some cases people will claim they always have the right version of the story, or that their telling of it is accurate. But as I'm now talking to you, I'm realizing that there's many different versions and many different interpretations, and even different eras of time where the stories have been written. And you
Yes.
can get sometimes, like you say, a more clearer view when you go deeper into the past, which is why I love studying ancient texts and tablets, because you're going far beyond what anyone else has taken and utilized for a base. And sometimes I think that gets you as closer to the truth as possible.
Yes, I mean, I'm interested in the kaleidoscope
Mhm.
of theology that was Christianity in the beginning. I'm very, very familiar with orthodoxy. That was my world for a very, very long time. But I've always been curious to know, well, what did the Christians believe before the canonization of the New Testament? What did they believe in the 200s? What did they believe in the 300s? And for many years, I taught courses in the history of Christian thought. And I think it's helpful for people to know Christianity hasn't always looked like it looks to us today. It too has evolved.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, this is really great confirmation for me, because this was the research that I had looked into. This was the research I had come up with, this information I had come up with, and the same concept of looking further back in time to get an account that I can see seemed to be untouched, unaltered, lack of agenda. And it's just incredible to get the confirmation from you. So thank you.
Well, I've always found this fascinating. I find you can go back to the Bible for a lifetime and keep finding new layers in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have a quick question in between all of this. A lot of people's perceptions are that the Bible may have been written in real time. In other words, somebody was following around Jesus and writing everything down, following Moses around and writing everything down in real time. What is your understanding through teaching that how this information was actually recorded for the parts that weren't remixed from ancient tablets and texts? How is it possible that people can be there to gather this information in real time?
Well, we do have some clues that we're not always looking at real-time reportage. So if we go back to the Old Testament, for instance, to the Hebrew scriptures, you'll find the name Yahweh, which became the Jewish name for God, although in my books I argue that's not what Yahweh meant in the beginning, that Yahweh was a particular individual, was an entity. And the name Yahweh appears very early in the Bible. It's there in Genesis 3 with the story of the fall, for instance, what Christians call the fall. And you might want to pause and say, wait a minute, this name wasn't revealed until the time of Moses. So that's ages after the action that's being described here. So how's the name in here?
Mm-hmm.
And what I love is that the Hebrew scriptures are very open. We are being shown that a writer after the time of Moses is retelling an older story, and so has imported the later name into the older text. We can see what the older word was that it's replacing because the writer has left it there. And it's Elohim, which means the powerful ones. So the Bible is very honest, saying originally this was a story about the powerful ones, but we who believe in Yahweh are retelling the story. So that's one example. It tells you straight away, okay, this is not real time. And another example would be you get into Genesis 6 with the story of the flood. And I would encourage anybody to read Genesis 6 alongside the various Mesopotamian flood stories, and you'll find so many correlations, it'll blow your hat off.
Mm-hmm.
But in the biblical telling of Noah's preparation, it becomes clear that there are two flood stories that have been woven together to make the one. Just follow the maths, you'll be able to see that. And that one of those tellings has been written after the giving of the Yahweh's laws, again, from an age far into the future. Mm-hmm. So when you start reading about clean and unclean animals in Genesis 6, again, we're being told openly, all right, somebody after the time of Moses is retelling an earlier story. That's why we're talking about clean and unclean animals.
Right.
So from the get-go, the Bible is very honest that there has been redaction and retelling that has gone on. And there are points when the Bible itself points to other sources. And it says, well, you can read the longer version of this story in such and such a book. And it's a book that you and I would have never heard of. Mm-hmm. So the Bible has evolved, has been redacted. Some of the story of that is there. If you get later into the book of Jeremiah and the books of 1 or 2 Kings, the book of Ezra, a little bit of the reworking and recrafting of the Bible is referenced in those texts. Mm. And so that's just one example that takes you beyond this fundamentalist reading of the Bible, as if you're reading science or as if you're reading a history book. You're not. You're reading another kind of literature. If you get into 1 or 2 Kings, for instance, or 1 or 2 Chronicles, again, you realize there's another reason this is being written, because you're getting action and then you're getting evaluation of that action. Mm-hmm. King such and such was a bad king because he did such and such. Oh, okay, so we now have got an evaluation layered on top of history. Or in the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah talks about the cult of Asherah, that on every high hill and under every green tree, the Jewish people would honor Asherah for having come in the past and taught their people agriculture, raising them from a life of subsistence, becoming civilization builders. He's given us all that information, and you might think, oh, wow, isn't that amazing? I wonder who she is. But then he sort of adds the sentence, isn't that awful? Isn't that idolatrous? Yeah. Oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't be interested. And there's the message, there's the agenda of that text. So you've got a blend of all sorts of things going on. You've got some history in there, but you've got some theology, you've got some moralizing, and you've got a lot of, so toe the line, this is the line.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So you said something interesting too. You said Elohim, right? The powerful ones. So that sounds plural to me. So this Elohim seems to be plural, multiple beings.
Yes, that's right. So Elohim is a masculine plural form word. It is a word that many Bibles translate as God, but in my books, Escaping from Eden and the Eden Conspiracy, I argue that that is not the right way to translate that word, and that if you read it in the plural, you will begin to recognize that you're reading the summary forms of the Anuna stories, the Anunnaki stories. It boils down to the fact that the Elohim word in Hebrew is the Hebrew word for Anunnaki. Mm-hmm. So it confuses people because it gets translated as God, but in other places, Elohim can be false gods. What are they, you might ask? Can be angels, can be landlords. Mm-hmm. It has this great elasticity to it. Sometimes it takes singular verbs. Sometimes it takes plural verbs. So in Genesis 20, for instance, Abraham is making reference to the fact that the Elohim, plural, told me, plural verb, to move. And so that's why he moved from the high place of Haldi, because the Elohim plural told him, plural, to do so. There are other moments, though, where it is used in the singular. So there's a story where Yahweh, who is one of the Elohim, this is clear in a number of places. Joshua 24, for instance, Joshua says, consider who you're going to serve, the Elohim of the Egyptians, the Elohim of Mesopotamia, or our Elohim Yahweh. They're all the same kind of being. They're all referred to in the plural, even as singular entities. So it's a very odd kind of word. But the plurality is there in the verbs, it's in the behavior, because the Elohim go to war against one another, and thousands of human beings are slaughtered in the conflict between them. They're referred to collectively as the Tseva Hashemayim, which recalls how they arrived. They're the airborne armies, and they're referred to as the governing force, the El Ba'adat, the power council. But there's a moment where Yahweh refers to himself as an Elohim. There's a moment where his king, Ahaziah, has fallen off a ladder and broken his back, and he wants to know if he's going to live. And he's heard that the Elohim in Ekron down the road is very good at medical prognostics. So he sends some people to inquire of the Elohim of Ekron, does he think I can get better? And according to the prophet Elijah, when Yahweh hears about this, he's absolutely furious. And he says, is there no Elohim here? Pointing to himself. That Ahaziah has to dance off to the Elohim of Ekron, and then he makes a pun out of his name to try and put the other Elohim down. But there you can see, oh, okay, they're rivals. Yahweh is the Elohim here, and this other one, the Lord of the Flies, as he calls him, his real name is the Lord and Prince, if you say it properly, he's the Elohim in Ekron. And so Yahweh has these peers among the Elohim, which is why when you get to the 10 Commandments, he says, I don't want you working for any other Elohim. You're not to bow down to them, and you're not to serve them. And of course, in that moment, we're not supposed to ask, sorry, who? Who are you talking about?
Right.
But clearly the Bible is, as you rightly say, Billy, full of a plurality of beings, these Elohim, of whom Yahweh is one. And you go to Psalm 82, Deuteronomy 32, you find out he is a junior Elohim, because when the lands are carved up and each Elohim, or Elohe is the singular, which does crop up from time to time, each one of them is given land. That means they own the resources under the land. They own the people on the land. Yahweh gets a people group with no land. No land, no resources. So he's going to have to go to war with other Elohim in order to get land and resources. And until you realize that, all the battles of the Old Testament make no sense at all. And they make no sense if you think Yahweh means the creative source of the cosmos. Why on earth would God need to go to war with these other little beings, whoever they are, and involve human foot? It doesn't make sense until you realize plural Elohim, of whom Yahweh is one.
Absolute facts. And right behind me are the Elohim of ancient Kemet, now known as Egypt. On the walls of this temple, you see some of what the ancient Kemetian people called the Neturu. And the Neturu came at the time of Zep Tepi, when the gods came from heaven to earth and turned mud into a kingdom. And at some point, they all went to war, just like you stated in the book of Deuteronomy.
I want to mention, and we would talk about external corroboration, but this is really interesting. I mentioned how Jeremiah, 1 and 2 Kings, Ezra talk about this narrative shift where Judaism becomes monotheism, and we have to forget all the other Elohim. So all the temples to Milcom, Dagon, Asherah, they have to be demolished. The altars have to be broken. The figurines of Asherah have to be broken so they can't be used in harvest festivals. Those priesthoods, which were Jewish priesthoods, set up by Jewish kings, had to be disbanded or slaughtered. And now we've just got this much simpler world where there is one God, Yahweh, and one king, and one high priest, and one temple in Jerusalem. All your tithes are going to go to that. So this narrative shift happens. This reform happens. It begins with a ritual reform, and then the scriptures themselves are put together and redacted into what we would know today.
Yeah.
Just this year in Jerusalem, we found an object from a moment just before all those reforms started taking place. And this was a seal that belonged to a senior Jewish figure called Yehoezer. So this is a seal that he's going to use to certify documents, to seal letters, to put his imprimatur on things. Very, very important item to him that really stands for his authority and his integrity. Senior Jewish figure. What's the picture on that seal? It's an Assyrian Dingir, or genie, or Anunnaki.
Yeah.
The classic winged Anunnaki. He saw no conflict between his worldview and having an Anunnaki on his ring for his seal. Because at that time, Judaism still spoke about the Elohim, still remembered the Tseva Hashemayim, still remembered what they looked like, because the Jerusalem temple hadn't been defaced so you could no longer see images of them. The Nehushtan hadn't been confiscated so you could no longer see what Yahweh looked like. And in their minds, the Elohim of Judaism were all part of this wider family of stories of Elohim, Tingir, Anunnaki, Anuna. There was no conflict. Right. And that is a real object discovered just this year to tell you that Judaism was something different before these ritual and narrative changes were brought in.
Right. Absolutely. That's just incredible.
And then you see that object, you're going to go back and you're going to read the Bible differently.
Yeah, I want to see this thing again. We're going to superimpose it over this video. It's just incredible. I remember reading in the Old Testament, it said they came across the Anak, and we were grasshoppers in their eyesight. So a reference there to some really big people, and they call them the Anak, which I thought was interesting, since the ancient texts talk about the Anunnaki and the Anuna. It seems like there's references of these beings as many different names all around the world.
That's right. I mean, in the plural, they're referred to as the Anakim, which sounds strangely like Anunnaki. And you've got Anak and the Anactorians in another part of the world. You've got Anak with a Q in the Muslim tradition. And the idea of there being much bigger people living in the world does repeat all around the world. It seems to be a bit of a taboo these days to talk about giants or people who are much, much bigger in the past. I don't know why it's become a taboo. It wasn't in the 19th century when we were digging up giant finds. And it wasn't, if you go to Josephus, he's completely unembarrassed by these stories. And he says in his writing, the Greek legends of the Titans, that's really their version of our memories of people like the Anakim and the men of renown produced through hybridization in Genesis 6. So Josephus saw these stories as referring to real cultural memory of sharing the planet with much bigger people. And I wonder also if there are memories of the time when we did share the planet with the Gigantopithecus and with the Denisovans and with the Chinese dragon people and with Homo floresiensis and the Neanderthals. There was a time when the human type was much, much more diverse.
Yes.
And we shouldn't be surprised to have cultural stories that seem to carry that memory. So I don't know why there's such a taboo around it today.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. It's just why the taboo, I don't even know. But I think a lot of it has to do with a lot of fear. I think a lot of people have been put in a fear state when it comes to their religion. And this fear prevents them from asking, looking deeper, researching deeper, trying to get a better understanding, because I think in some ways they think that they're offending their God, or that's at least what I think they believe.
Yes, I think some people construct their faith like a Jenga tower. These, I don't know if you've ever played Jenga, where you've got these little wooden blocks, you build a tower, and then you have to pull little pieces out and see if the towers still stand up.
Yeah.
And I think some people carry their faith in that way. And if you start pulling out a piece down here, like, do we have to read the Bible in a fundamentalist way? Were there giants? Was Asherah a real entity? Is Elohim really plural? They think if you pull that piece out, the whole tower's going to collapse and they won't have anything left. Whereas I think it's more helpful to have all your Jenga pieces on the table so you can pick them up one at a time and look at it and talk about it and consider what's going on there. And when you go to theological college to train for the ministry, or if you go to university and study theology as I did, they force you to put all the Jenga pieces on the table. We're going to look at them, one at a time. We're going to do different courses over 3 or 4 years so that we can look at these things individually. And it can be scary for people because they think, am I going to be able to put that tower back together again? Because I get a lot of comfort from my faith, and it seems to explain my life and experiences that I have. I don't want to be in a position where I can't put it back together again. And I think it's that kind of fear that comes in. Whereas as someone who's sort of been through that process a couple of times, because it happened when I did my honors degree in theology, and then it happened again when I started studying the Mesopotamian sources and had to go back to the Bible to re-understand what was there. There is a little bit of reframing that has to go on. It can be unsettling, but for me, it is incredibly enriching. For me, truth can only be enriching, can only be empowering, even if there's a little bit of uncertainty en route.
Right. Absolutely. This is an incredible discussion, man. This is really, really good. I'm glad we decided to do this because I'm getting a lot of incredible confirmation from you. And I'm also learning so much as well because you're giving me a lot of key points that I know myself now. I want to go back and dig into and research and look at it and gain some of my own perspectives as well, which is important. I think everyone should be able to do that. Everyone should have the right to ask questions, to dig deeper, to not be afraid to research and to look into what they believe in without feeling any type of punishment or anything that's going to come to harm them. I believe it's my God-given right to be able to look deeper into anything I come across.
Yes, I think so. I think there are forms of Christianity that have discouraged curiosity, unfortunately. So, I mean, there's this verse that often gets repeated, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. And you don't want to do that. There's this doctrine of the fall that says, well, your own understanding is impaired. So, better not get too far into the world of logic and reason because you're going to make a mistake. And Christians can be made very anxious rather than curious. Whereas I find, especially when I read the Gospels and I try to get to the root meaning of the key words in Jesus' teaching, he's actually trying to stoke our curiosity. And there's plenty in the Old Testament as well from some of the later prophets and in the devotional writings that would want us to be seekers, truth seekers, explorers, want us to be curious. And I think it's a shame that very often, both in Catholic and Reformed Christianity, curiosity has been discouraged, even to the point of the church pushing back on new science and new discoveries.
Yeah, I know. And so, there's a verse, because some people seem to get extremely agitated when they hear me talk about the fact that I believe that we are gods, that God is in us and we're inside of God. In other words, I believe that we're a fractal of God, not that we're a God that we can create a universe, but I believe in the fractal mathematics of the universe, and which is a mathematical formula that has been discovered and well documented called the Mandelbrot set. And that Mandelbrot set shows that we're living in this created reality So yes, the Bible is right, the Quran is right, all these indigenous cultures around the world, I believe they're accurate. We're living in a creation. It just describes the mathematics behind the creation. And so if everything is a fractal throughout the entire known universe, I believe that a fractal of the God consciousness, the divine energy itself, is in every atom in my body. So
Yes.
thereby, I am a fractal of God walking in the flesh, so that God can know what is it like to experience life through the eyes of Billy Carson. What is it like to experience life through the eyes of Paul Anthony Wallace? You know?
Yeah, I'm absolutely with you. It's a very Platonic way of seeing things, and I see it that way too. There's a moment in the gospel where people were accusing Jesus of equating himself with God, and he says, but doesn't the scripture say ye are all gods? And then there's a wonderful definition of God, the New Testament God, given by the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, chapter 17. He's talking to a non-religious audience. So they're not Jewish believers, they're not Christian believers. So he needs to clarify what he means by God. He's using the Greek word theos. And he gives a nice description of the Greek understanding of theos, their word for God, the word that Jesus used. And he said, by theos, I mean the source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being, of which we are all offspring.
Yes.
And I love that, because I think that's a definition of God that people way beyond the world of faith could accept, could do business with.
Yeah.
It's saying my intelligence is a participation in one of the properties of the cosmos, intelligence. My consciousness is a participation in the consciousness that's endemic to the cosmos. And it comes back to what you were saying, the cosmos experiencing itself through what I see, through what I hear, through what I feel, through what I experience. And I find that a very empowering description of God, because there's no separation in it. You and I couldn't be closer to the source by Paul's definition there. There's nothing we have to do to scramble back into the presence of God, because we are all emanations of God. Exactly. I find it empowering. Religion trades on separation anxiety. Religion trades on the idea that you and I are separated from God, and you need to do A, B, and C to get into his good books, because you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of him. And we, the priests, or we, the teachers, will tell you how to do that. It is a recipe for all kinds of psychological abuse and manipulations, which I've seen plenty of in the world of church ministry in my time as a minister and as a church attender. I see plenty of it. And at the beginning of the gospel, there are some wonderful sayings from Jesus, which you can find not only in the canonical gospels, but in the extra canonical gospels as well. So in the Gospel of Matthew, we're told the message Jesus toured with the beginning of his public ministry. And by the conventional translation, it sounds like typical revivalist preacher, grave warning, trying to threaten you into being a good believer. The conventional translation is repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And it sounds like he's saying, you better clean your life up, because God's about to show up. You don't want to get on the wrong side of him and offend him. And we hear that through the lens of later doctrines of heaven and hell and all that sort of thing. Sounds like a grave warning. You go to the Greek, go to the root meanings of those words. And metanoiete means go beyond the mind. That means go beyond what you think with more than this, go beyond the mind, re-understand, transcend your current understanding, repent for the basileon uranon. Basileon can be a kingdom, but if I say kingdom, you think, oh, that's a place where I serve the king. I have to do everything the king says. And we get into that religious paradigm of obedience versus sin and punishment, obedience and reward, all that sort of thing. You don't have to translate it kingdom. You could equally translate it with the word realm. Now, a realm has a very different connotation to it. A realm is something amazing to be explored. And uranon, well, that's the word for sky. That's the word for space. it could be used as a word for the cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
And the word has come close, can be reached out and taken hold of. You put that together and he's saying, go beyond the mind, transcend your mind, because the realm of the cosmos is available to you, is impossibly close. And then later when he says the realm of the cosmos is within you, there couldn't be a more profound invitation to explore inner space, outer space, to explore the principles of the cosmos. And that can mean explorations in the way of spirituality, in the way of science, in the way of cosmology. It is a huge exploration we've been invited on by Jesus, but that is not how it has been taught, translated, and preached for 2,000 years. And that habitual thinking, that religious entrainment is so strong that people find it very difficult to get beyond their English translations back to the Greek, back to the Aramaic, back to the Hebrew, and begin asking, what was this really about in the beginning?
Yeah. Yeah. That's so incredible, because I went back to the Aramaic. I had a podcast where I talked about this about a year and a half ago or so. And I told them, break this down. Let's go back to the root word. Let's go back to the Hebrew. And I had my Hebrew book and I had my Aramaic book on my desk at my previous location. And I was showing people that these words are not exactly what we think they are when you go back to the root and the original translations of these words, the original language of these words. You find out that it means something totally different, something more empowering, something even more incredible, something so much deeper than this surface thing that just tries to make you seem like, if you don't do this, this is going to happen, or you're going to be in trouble, or something like that.
And I want to just tell people, if they think, well, how on earth do I do that? There are resources that I am so thankful that they're in my possession and have been for decades, that it opened this world up to people. So the first thing you need to do is get hold of an interlinear Bible. So a New Testament where it's showing you the Greek words, and it'll usually have a couple of translations either side, so you can see how different Bible translators have dealt with what's in the text. And then you can do that with the Hebrew as well. And then you need a really authoritative lexicon. So for the New Testament, you'd go to the Bauer, Arndt, Gingrich, and Danker lexicon. For Hebrew, you'd go into Brown, Driver, Briggs. And what's wonderful about those books is that they show you how those words are used in all different places. So you can get the full scope of the word, and then it'll break it down so you can see the most primitive aspects of that word. And sometimes if you go back to the text and use the more primitive reading, that's the best way of unpeeling 2,000 years of habitual thinking. That's how you get beyond the religious entrainment to see what did this mean in the beginning. Sometimes, and this is especially true of some key words in the Old Testament, if you leave the words untranslated and just watch how they behave in the stories, all of a sudden you'll see things about stories that you didn't notice before, particularly if you want to morally evaluate what's happening in texts, or to evaluate it for whether you're looking at something spiritual or something sort of flesh and bone or something technological. Sometimes just leave the word untranslated for a while and see what happens. There are online resources for people. You can go to Bible Hub and you'll find interlinear resources there. And there's a built-in lexicon you can use there, which is very, very helpful. It gets you quite a long way. But if you can get hold of those books, that really breaks you out of the narrow fundamentalist, you can only read it this way kind of world that a lot of church people, unfortunately, find themselves trapped in.
Right. Absolutely. And when you begin to see the broader, bigger picture, for me at least, it's so empowering. And it really brings me back to one of the verses in the Bible where it said, you should do greater things than I, right? So we're supposed to do greater things. I believe that's referencing Jesus, than Jesus himself.
Well, yeah, that's right. What you're saying was right, Betty, because, and it's interesting. I have, through all my years of faith, always seen Jesus as a model, that he's showing us what is possible.
Yes.
And in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, the writer there is at pains to say that Jesus was human in exactly the same way as you and me. And he really spells that out. And then Jesus says, as you rightly say, what you've seen me do, these and even greater things shall you do. And even when I get back to the prologue to the gospel in the Gospel of John, the story arc of Jesus's life of pre-existing this material life, incarnating and having these experiences and struggles and this journey, and then outlasting this life to a new experience, what the Gnostics call going to the great repose, or what Jesus talked about, returning to source, returning to the Father. I think that's given as a template for all our lives. And that was sort of the general worldview at that time. That was how Plato understood who we really are at a deeper level. And many of the first Christians went to these texts from Plato. That was their worldview, and they recognized it when they read the Gospel of John. And so they were far more inclined, I believe, to see Jesus as this model of what is possible for us, as this picture of human development and ascension. And it's only later religion that has put Jesus up here and us all the way down here, and all we can do is pay, pray, and obey. That is, I think, a real distortion of the empowering message that I think all the gospel writers, including the canonical writers, intended for their readers. Yeah,
absolutely. And like you say, I see Jesus as an archetype for us to model ourselves after, That's interesting. I've been in podcasts before where I mentioned, well, they bring it up. People ask me, what about Jesus? And what do you think about Jesus? And after I give them my opinion of Jesus as an incredible archetype for mankind to follow, and in a couple of podcasts, I mentioned that, they discovered the gospel of Jesus, his wife, and a young professor at the University of Harvard, brought it to their attention and it's in the Harvard Seminary. I never said that Jesus was married as a hard statement, but I did say that it could have been that maybe he got married, maybe he had kids, maybe the Merovingian bloodline is still on this planet till this very day. People kind of took that out of context and warped it a little bit. But as I dug into the story about this text of this gospel of Jesus's wife, it was just pretty interesting to see that there was a lot of pushback on that, and it was for years.
Yes,
a lot of years.
I don't fully understand why there is so much pushback on that question. Bart Ehrman, who's a biblical scholar, said just the other day, what does it matter? If Jesus, but it does seem to matter to people. And I think that's really illustrated by the pushback that it was Karen King, wasn't it?
Correct.
Who did the study on the Gospel of Jesus' wife and published on it. So she's a Harvard Divinity School professor, so she knows her stuff. And it didn't go much for that document, which appears to have been a Coptic translation of a Greek text from the 200s, although the papyrus, I think, dates from a little later, doesn't go much further than you can find in the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. I think Pistis Sophia is the other one, where it's very clear that in those documents, bearing in mind, my question is not what really happened. My question is, what did the early Christians believe? There were clearly early Christians who believed that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a very close relationship. The Gospel of Philip said he used to kiss her frequently on the mouth. All those documents said there was a bit of conflict between Mary Magdalene and Peter, because Peter reckoned he was the senior disciple, and yet Mary Magdalene was getting teachings from Jesus that they weren't getting. And she was a teaching figure as well. So they all sort of corroborate each other on those points, or maybe they borrow from each other. But then the Gospel of Jesus' wife goes that one step forward and uses the word wife. Jesus refers to a woman as his wife, and she will be able to be my disciple. What is the problem with that? Now, clearly there is a problem. It clearly upsets people because the Vatican almost immediately says, oh, this is clearly false.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got a professor from the University of Durham, Francis Watson, I think it was, who said, oh, that can't be right. And he hadn't even handled the document, if I understand correctly. I'm sorry, Francis Watson, if I'm doing you an injustice, but I don't think he had handled the document before saying, oh, that's clearly rubbish. But then, thankfully, Roger Bagnall, professor of history at Yale, comes forward and endorses what Karen King is saying. And then the Harvard Review does serious study on the fragment itself. And they said there's absolutely no evidence that this is a forgery or fake.
Correct.
But because of the pushback, and here we are in the 21st century, where you'll often hear people say, oh, that's been debunked. And all that means is they've heard someone with a different opinion speak strongly about it.
Facts.
It's not been debunked. It has not been falsified.
Mm-hmm.
Very senior, credible authorities, people who have had possession of the fragment, have studied it, have said there's no evidence of fakery or forgery. So the Vatican really can't have an opinion because it hadn't done that work, and it responded so quickly with that opinion. Karen King had taken her time over it. Harvard backed her up. A professor from Yale backed her up. But still the story circulates, oh, that's been debunked.
Yeah.
It
got a lot of pushback.
But why is it important? And it mystifies me a little bit, but, the church forcing people to recant has a pretty ugly history throughout church history.
Thank you. Tell me, preach, brother.
Whether we're talking about Galileo or Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, why is it necessary to force people to recant? I remember there was he was a huge figure in the world of evangelical Christianity, John Stott. He was a senior pastor at a major Anglican church in the UK, but he had a global ministry as a teacher and a writer. And he wrote, actually it's in a book behind me here, this book here, Essentials. He wrote, as an evangelical, so almost a fundamentalist, he wrote about the doctrine of hell. And he said, this is a church doctrine. But when you get to the root meanings of the key words in the New Testament, it is insupportable. The Gospels and New Testament talk about something else.
Yeah.
But the church has distorted it into a doctrine of hell with which people have been terrified and manipulated for century after century. And he said, I stand in the Reformed tradition that says that we should change our beliefs if they're contradicted by the sources we claim. And we should go back to the Bible, he said, back to the Gospels, back to the New Testament, and just test that doctrine because I believe it's incorrect. Never mind that John Stott had been on an absolute pedestal. He was like the Pope of the evangelical world internationally. But when he said that, the pushback was appalling.
Yeah.
And he was forced to recant in the end. Now, in my book, The Eden Conspiracy, I make the case that John Stott was right, that the church doctrine of hell is a distortion. And there are people teaching it who are teaching it on an entirely false footing, still distorting texts to this day.
Yeah.
And so pushback, what does that mean? It's been debunked. What does that mean? What that really is a story of bullying. It's not a story of falsification. The gospel of Jesus' wife has not been falsified, but Karen King has been bullied. That's the story. And I think any seeker of truth, any curious person, any person who's interested in sort of academic objectivity should be horrified by that. and just
Absolutely.
go to the people who have the fragment, who have done the study, and find out what they're saying. Now, this is not something to go to the stake over. I agree with Bart Ehrman. What does it matter if Jesus had a girlfriend?
It doesn't
What
matter.
does it matter if Jesus had a wife? What is that threatening? But I think early on what it was threatening is that there's always been a consistent agenda to push women out of the picture. A woman in a lot of religious traditions can be a virgin or a mother of somebody great, but they can't be a teacher. They can't be an authority. And even to this day, I think women have a hard go in the church, Karen King included. And I think the church still needs to clean up its act on that front, all the while trying to take credit for emancipation, being progressive, so on and so forth. But it has not been. It's been a terrible force for conservatism, and all kinds of misogyny has been done in the name of religion throughout the ages. I think we need to move beyond that. Personally, I think it makes Jesus more interesting.
Yeah.
If he had a girlfriend or if he had a wife.
Why not? The angels were having sex with human beings.
that doesn't damage. Well, that's right. If you're talking about Genesis 6, that's right. Beings thought of as angels. I wouldn't use that word myself.
Yeah. Right.
Because angel doesn't tell you. Angel doesn't tell you what kind of being it is. It just says it's somebody on assignment, someone with a message. But if Jesus had a wife or had a girlfriend, it does not make me respect his teachings any the less than before. So I think it's all the kerfuffle around that is very strange.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And you're right about women being oppressed over eons, really. I mean, it's so obvious. You know, I had a conversation with somebody recently where they were trying to argue with me that wherever Christianity popped up, women were like given a certain level of freedom, and they rose up, and they were like, I was like, really? I mean, when I look at history books, I'm not getting that information. You know, I'm not seeing that anywhere.
I'm not sure I believe that. The one place you could go to for that would be the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army was a really interesting movement right at the beginning. I don't know how strong they are in the States, but I grew up very aware of William Booth and the Salvation Army in the UK. And they were a great force in terms of social welfare, but they were also very powerful evangelists back in the day. And they had women evangelists and leaders from the get-go.
Yeah.
But they only had it because they broke free from the religious mainstream, and they suffered a lot of persecution because of it.
A lot of women have been killed. A lot of women have suffered greatly in the earliest communities. There was a lot of oppression, and it was pretty bad. And you just, as you go through time, you discover even in the 3rd through 5th centuries, their women were still being oppressed in Christianity and in Greco-Roman era. I mean, you just keep going and going. You had the burning of the female witches. We had we had the heresy movement. There was just so many things going on that were just mind-boggling. And I'm going, I don't know if that's 100% accurate. There may be times and maybe areas where women were giving a little bit of opportunity, but I mean, women were just able to vote. Not too long ago. So, and it was, of course, as you know, in a lot of the biblical texts, they weren't even allowed inside the church at some time, in ancient times. But it's just a gradual process where you can see.
Yeah, I think women, you can see women being pushed out through the Bible in a number of different ways. I think when the female powerful being, the female Elohim Asherah, was sort of demonized and pushed out, that was not just defaming her. I think it really was defaming female wisdom. Traditionally, there's a lot of formation and initiation of young people in traditional cultures by women, and all of a sudden that gets demonized. The wise woman is now a problem. So, I mean, think of King Saul. Who do kings consult when they need higher wisdom?
Mm.
Saul wanted to consult a female who was known for having far sight and future sight. And we're allowed to know that, but we have to call her a witch.
Mm-hmm.
The Witch of Endor. You get into English church history, you get to the period of the Tudors. They were consulting wise women. They were consulting people way outside of the mainstream of Christian religion. But if a member of the public did that, that's when the call of witchcraft would get made.
Mm-hmm.
And this even happened to Princess Elizabeth before she became Queen Elizabeth I. She consulted with John Dee to find out how the succession would go. John Dee nearly lost his life because he did an astrological reading for Princess Elizabeth.
Mm.
Tudors are followed by King James, and I love telling people this who are sort of the King James is the only Bible. I like telling them about King James because he was the most appalling person, and there were things about that translation that were done in order to favor monarchy so as not to offend King James. Mm-hmm. And then King James decides he's going to become the Witchmaster General, and he is going to personally run this campaign of rounding up witches and then burning them. Mm. Bearing in mind, we're still in a period where kings and queens will consult astrologers and diviners and this, that, and the other. Mm-hmm. But if a member of the public does it, that's a crime. And if that person's done a consultation for someone I don't like, now they're a witch.
Yeah.
Now we're going to burn them alive. And, we talk about witch burnings. We need to remember what we're talking about is the burning of women. Yeah. We really need to throw the word witch away. Mm-hmm. These were wise women who were consulted because they were wise, because they had understanding of sciences, anthropology, because they had an understanding of natural medicine. Mm-hmm. They were women. Yeah. And this was done in the name of the church, in the name of Christianity, by the defender of the faith, King James himself. Mm. And there are so many injustices that have been done in the name of God because of the confusion, Billy, that we mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. If you were going to read stories about violent, brutal, unforgiving, psychopathic Elohim and call them God's stories, you've got a problem. Because if you worship a God who is a xenophobe, you have to justify xenophobia, you have to become xenophobic. Yep. If you worship a God who hates women so much that he considers menstruation to be disgusting and evil and they shouldn't be anywhere near the community when that's happening, well, you have to take on that misogynistic view as well. I mean, what a stupid view that is. Yeah. We all come from women. We all depend on the natural cycles of women. But because the being Yahweh hated adult human females to that extent, so those who worshipped him had to take that value on as well. And you really can draw a straight line from equating God with some of these Elohim and Yahweh stories, a straight line from that to all kinds of misogyny, colonialism, enslavement of other people groups, all kinds of cruelty, justified because this is what God does, and we're only doing God's work.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's unfortunate. It really is unfortunate. This is a great talk, man. This is going to be a very powerful podcast because I can see now how it's going to really educate a lot of people. And I want people out there to make no mistake about it. We're not here bashing Christians. We're not attacking anybody. We're laying out actual factual information that you can then go back and research for yourself. And like I say, and Paul says, I think there's a lot of great information in the Bible. I think there's a lot of great information in other religious texts as well. It's just we're talking about today, we're talking about discernment. We're talking about understanding from different perspectives so you can gain a much broader view of everything. And it doesn't mean that your God doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that you've been, you wasted your life. It doesn't mean any of that. But what it does mean is, there's deeper, broader, more intriguing and incredible stories that we haven't really been able to see because we've been given a forced, closed view of what actually happened. And without that other deeper level of understanding, we might not get the better and bigger perspective of everything.
I think that's right. I think one of the things that distorted our view is that for the best part of 2,000 years, Christianity has presented the New Testament as if it's a continuation of the Old Testament. You find them glued together with a hardcover either side of them that suggests it's all one book, all talking about the same thing, all talking about the same God. And as a follower of Jesus, one thing I have had to do that's not been easy is to reframe that and understand, no, it's actually a story of discontinuity. Mm-hmm. All the gospel writers, and I think I'd say this is especially the canonical gospel writers, are at pains to present Jesus as the successor to and replacement of Moses, bringing teachings that will delete and replace the law and laws of Yahweh. Mm-hmm. That's a story of discontinuity. That's why Christianity has never been built on Yahweh's laws. That's why in Acts 15, the early church came to the agreement that to be a follower of Jesus, you don't have to be a Yahwist. Mm. That's why in Colossians, Paul said that the written code was cancelled and wiped out through the life and death of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And yet, Christians around the world still feel somehow they have to justify Yahweh, the figure of Yahweh and the stories around him and the laws he brought. Mm-hmm. But it is a story of discontinuity. And I think that has been a real light bulb for me. It's been really liberating. I think for me, it allowed me to switch my conscience back on when I read the Old Testament, because as you rightly say, Billy, it is full of violence, full of gratuitous violence, done by these Elohim, including Yahweh. And as soon as you realize, okay, Jesus wasn't teaching us to follow Yahweh, you can begin to evaluate those stories. And if you evaluate those stories by Jesus's morality, then you can fully see that you're reading something appalling. Mm-hmm. There are many reasons we would want to get rid of the laws in the Old Testament. I mean, here's the death penalty. I just made some notes. Striking one's parents, death penalty. Mm-hmm. Pronouncing a curse over one's parents, death penalty. Going to an astrologer or doing divination, like we're just talking about, death penalty. Having a different religion, death penalty. Mm-hmm. Adultery, death penalty. Well, I, for one, am very pleased that Jesus came along with teachings to delete and replace all of that, because I think that's terrible. Yeah. What the Bible has to say about slavery, Leviticus 25, when it comes to slavery, only foreigners can be slaves, it says. Mm-hmm. And you can leave slaves to your kids as property. Mm-hmm. Really? Oh, that's a great law, isn't it? And then that sort of overlaps with the behavior of the character of Yahweh. Don't think when Yahweh wants cattle and gold and virgin girls that it's talking about the priests having those things. That's a separate allotment in that list. Yahweh has his own list. Mm-hmm. So you should be asking a lot of questions there. I mean, this is not the creator of the universe. Mm-hmm. This is an entity. What does the entity want with those things? As you begin to read it this way, understand Yahweh is one of the Elohim, other things begin to make sense. You realize why in 1 Samuel 8, the leaders of the tribes of Israel did their level best to get rid of him and sack him and replace him with a human leader. It makes no sense. If Yahweh is the transcendent God, creator of the cosmos, it makes no sense at all. Soon as you bring it down to earth, realize that you're reading about Elohim / Anunnaki governing over human beings, unjustly, brutally. Everything clicks into place, and you will begin to understand what all the drama of the Old Testament is about.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think Christians should have a head start in this.
Yeah.
I am not out there to debunk Christianity. I'm there to say, Christians, wake up. Go back and read these stories in the light of Jesus' teaching.
Mm-hmm.
See the discontinuity between the old and the new. And if you're really not sure about it, I've got some verses from John 8 I'd love to read, because I think, for me, this was a real wake-up moment. I'd always wondered about this passage, but because of the one Bible thing, Old and New Testament, because I thought it's the same God from cover to cover, I'd always puzzled around this. As soon as I realized its discontinuity, it makes sense. So here we are in John's Gospel, chapter 8, verse 27. It says, they did not know that what Jesus was speaking about was the Father. So this is a reminder that Jesus never once spoke the word Yahweh. He spoke about theos, that Greek word for God that Paul used and gave that wonderful definition for. He spoke about Father, the one in the heavens, he says. And he addresses that God as Abba, which means sir or daddy. So that's him in the canonical Gospels. And then Jesus is speaking in John 8, and he says, I speak of what I have seen of the Father. You do what you have heard from your father. So he's talking to Jewish leaders, and he's saying, my father's not the same as your father. So for a start, 8:41, you do the works of your father. Well, who's he talking about? Who's their father? Who can that possibly be if it isn't Yahweh?
Yeah.
And then he says, verse 42, if theos, Greek word for God, if theos were your father, you would have loved me, because I came forth and have come from theos. There we are, an emanation of the source.
Yes.
Verse 44, you are of your father, the devil, and you are intent on doing the desires of your father. Now, when he says the devil, that doesn't necessarily mean there's only one devil and that their father is it. But the devil is certainly not a compliment.
No.
You are of your father, the devil, and you are intent on doing the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning. Well, we've just been talking about that. All the killings that Yahweh does and orders people to do, not just soldiers, but civilians, not just men, but women and children and babies. We're talking about war crimes, to use the modern language for it. He was a murderer from the beginning. He didn't stand in or hold to or deal with truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, that is his thing, because he is a liar and the father of lies, or it can mean a false father. You claim that my father is your God, i.e. Yahweh, but you do not know my father. I do. So he's proclaiming something completely new, very different to the father of the Jewish leaders, and it's new to his disciples as well. So later in John's Gospel, Philip says, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. And Jesus says, wow, I've been with you so long, Philip, and yet you do not know me. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And we're back to that emanation of the source. Yeah. And I'll just finish with another reference, because, again, it was a light bulb moment for me when I saw it. Once I understood there's this discontinuity going on, there's this cessation of the laws of Yahweh, and Jesus is bringing something totally new and liberating. He says, and this comes up in Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, he says, which of you fathers, if your children were hungry and thirsty, would give them a stone or give them a snake? And many readers today would read that and say, well, that's ridiculous. Of course, what kind of father would do that? But not realize that the Jewish hearers would know straight away, oh, I can think of someone who did that. And that was in fact Yahweh, who gave a stone when people were thirsty, who gave serpents to people who were hungry and anxious in the desert.
Yep.
Serpents can mean dragons. Fiery serpents, which went and attacked the people. Again, men, women, children, babies, attacked by snakes because they were desperate and fed up of emergency rations in the desert. Here's a stone. I'll show you how to get water. Here's snakes. So that would have been the bells ringing when Jesus said, what kind of father does that to hungry children?
Yeah.
And then in that original story where they've all been bitten by snakes, a brass dragon is created and lifted up. And the order from Moses is kowtow. Kowtow to the dragon. Bow down to the dragon or you'll die.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a Bible behind me where the heading over that story is Yahweh's mercy. Well, if that's Yahweh's mercy, what does his wrath look like?
Wow.
And that's why Jesus came, to cancel the law and laws of Yahweh and replace it with something else. That's why it was canceled, wiped out, according to Colossians 2:14. That's why we shouldn't regard those stories as having any purpose other than bringing people to Jesus. That's what Paul says in the book of Galatians. And that's why so many teachings are framed in the Gospels when Jesus says, you've heard it said, Moses said, but I say this. And there is the story of discontinuity. So Christians, I think, ought to have a head start and go back to the stories and say, well, if these are not stories about God, what are they about? And my book, The Eden Conspiracy, asks that question and says there is a rich education waiting for us. The Bible is full of truth. I'm not here to debunk the Bible. The Bible is full of truth, but we've misunderstood it. We've mistranslated it. And once we get beyond our habitual religious, habitual translations, there's a rich education waiting for